A real estate developer storms into a neighborhood bar, demanding elderly patrons sign over their properties for pennies on the dollar. When the 72-year-old refuses, the suited thug pours beer over the old man's head while his crew laughs and threatens the other seniors. But the quiet stranger sipping ginger ale in the corner isn't just another customer. This is Mike Tyson himself. The developer has no idea he just humiliated a senior citizen in front of a man who spent decades destroying opponents with his bare hands. While the corporate bully continues terrorizing defenseless elderly people, the former heavyweight champion rises from his stool with deadly calm. The old-timers recognize their savior and step back, knowing justice is about to be delivered with legendary precision. The developer's muscle keeps intimidating, thinking they're about to crush another helpless victim, but they're actually facing the most feared fighter in boxing history. What happens when you pick the wrong bar to terrorize senior citizens? Will the corporate thug survive learning why some legends never lose their edge? What happened next would terrorize the developer for the rest of his pathetic existence. Before we jump back and tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The evening light filtered through the dust-streaked windows of Murphy's Tavern, casting long shadows across the worn oak bar, where Ruby Wilson wiped down glasses with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been doing it for years. At 45, she had the steady hands and sharp eyes of a woman who knew her business, and her business was taking care of people. Frank Kowalski settled onto his usual corner stool with a grateful sigh, his 72-year-old frame moving carefully but purposefully. The retired sanitation worker's calloused hands wrapped around the cold beer Ruby slid across the bar without being asked. 40 years of emptying garbage cans had bent his back and lined his face, but his gentle blue eyes still held the kindness that made him beloved in the neighborhood. "How's the grandson doing, Frank?" Ruby asked, already knowing the answer would make him smile. "Starting college next month," Frank said, pride evident in his voice. "Engineering. First in the family." He took a slow sip of his beer, savoring both the taste and the moment. At the small table by the window, Dorothy Martinez arranged her purse and sweater with the precise movements of someone who'd spent decades working with her hands. The 68-year-old former seamstress kept her silver hair in a neat bun, and her brown eyes missed nothing that happened on the street outside. She nodded to Ruby, who brought over her usual glass of red wine. "Arthritis acting up again," Dorothy said, flexing her fingers. "Rain's coming." Earl Patterson entered with the quiet dignity that had made him a respected fixture in the neighborhood for 4 decades. At 75, the tall, distinguished black man still dressed formally for even casual occasions. Pressed slacks, clean white shirt, gold-rimmed glasses catching the light. He took his place at the end of the bar, unfolding yesterday's newspaper. With careful precision. "The usual Earl?" Ruby asked. "Please, my dear." His formal speech carried the weight of old-school courtesy. Earl had owned the corner grocery for 40 years, serving as unofficial community banker and counselor. Everyone knew his story. One of the first black business owners in the neighborhood, he'd faced discrimination but earned respect through persistence and fairness. This was the rhythm Ruby loved most, the comfortable familiarity of people who'd known each other for decades. Frank would share updates about his family. Dorothy would offer sharp observations about neighborhood changes, and Earl would provide thoughtful commentary on the day's news. These weren't just customers, they were family she'd chosen. Ruby glanced at the clock, 7:15 p.m. Peak time for the evening regulars, when working people stopped for a drink before heading home and retirees gathered for their daily social hour. The tavern felt warm and alive, filled with the easy conversation of people who belonged together. The front door swung open with unusual force, the brass hinges protesting with a sharp squeal that cut through the comfortable murmur of conversation. Vincent Carbone stepped inside, his expensive suit immediately marking him as an outsider in this working-class sanctuary. At 45, he carried himself with the arrogant confidence of someone accustomed to getting his way. 2 younger men followed, clearly muscle, their eyes scanning the room like predators sizing up prey. The comfortable conversation died as Carbone surveyed the tavern with calculating blue eyes. Ruby felt her stomach tighten with instinctive wariness. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" she asked, her voice steady despite the sudden tension. Carbone's smile was cold as winter steel. Actually, yes. We need to have a conversation with your customers. Here. Carbone approached Frank's corner stool while his men positioned themselves strategically, one by the door, another near the window, effectively blocking the exits. The expensive fabric of his suit whispered against itself as he moved, a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the suddenly quiet tavern. "Mr. Kowalski, isn't it?" Carbone's voice carried the smooth authority of someone used to intimidating people with legal terminology. "We represent Apex Development Corporation. We've been trying to reach you about your apartment building." Frank set down his beer with trembling hands, confusion clouding his gentle features. "I don't understand. My mortgage payments are current. I always. Unfortunately, that's not entirely accurate." Carbone produced a leather portfolio, extracting official-looking documents with practiced efficiency. "According to our records, you're significantly behind on payments. These papers detail the outstanding debt and offer a simple solution to avoid foreclosure proceedings." Ruby moved closer, her bartender's instincts telling her to stay within earshot. She'd seen enough con artists to recognize one, and everything about this man screamed trouble. Dorothy looked up from her wine, her sharp brown eyes immediately focusing on the papers Carbone spread across the bar. "Those look like the documents I received about Patrick's auto shop," she said quietly. Same letterhead, same threatening language. Earl carefully folded his newspaper, his formal bearing unchanged but tension visible in the set of his shoulders. "I received similar papers regarding my store building. Claimed I owed back taxes I know I paid." Carbone's cold smile widened as he realized his targets were comparing notes. "Business is business, ladies and gentlemen. Property ownership involves complex legal obligations. Sometimes elderly residents become confused about their responsibilities." The condescension in his voice made Ruby's hands clench around her bar towel. Frank studied the papers with growing bewilderment, his weathered fingers tracing lines of legal text he couldn't fully comprehend. "I need to consult my nephew," Frank said finally. "He's a lawyer. He handles my important papers." Carbone's demeanor shifted subtly, the smooth facade cracking to reveal something harder underneath. "Mr. Kowalski, I'm trying to help you here. These proceedings can become very expensive very quickly. Legal fees, court costs, penalties, they add up fast for someone on a fixed income." Tommy DeLuca, the muscle by the door, stepped closer. At an almost imperceptible nod from his boss, the younger man's presence cast a shadow over Frank's corner of the bar, his silence more threatening than any spoken words. "The smart move," Carbone continued, his voice taking on an edge, "is to sign these papers tonight. Clean slate, fresh start. No lawyers, no courts, no stress for a man your age." Dorothy set down her wine glass with deliberate precision. "Patrick always said never sign anything without reading it 3 times and sleeping on it twice. Unfortunately, Mrs. Martinez, time is a luxury your neighbors don't have. These legal matters have deadlines. Miss them, and the consequences become severe." Earl straightened in his seat, 60 years of business experience evident in his measured response. "In my experience, young man, anyone who pressures you to sign papers immediately is someone you shouldn't sign papers for at all." The tension in the room ratcheted higher as Carbone's mask slipped further. Ruby watched the dynamic shift, recognizing the moment when a bad situation was about to become worse. "Mr. Kowalski," Carbone said, his voice now carrying an unmistakable threat, "I'm trying to help you here. But if you want to make this difficult..." At that moment, the tavern door opened again with a gentle creak, and a man entered quietly. Average height, wearing worn jeans and a plain gray sweatshirt, he kept a faded Yankees baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. He moved to the far end of the bar, away from the confrontation, settling onto a stool with the careful economy of movement that spoke of someone comfortable in his own skin. Ruby felt grateful for any distraction from the mounting tension as she approached the new customer. The stranger had kind eyes beneath the bill of his cap, and when he looked up at her, she noticed old scars across his knuckles and a distinctive tattoo partially visible at his collar. "What can I get you?" she asked, her voice carrying more warmth than usual in the oppressive atmosphere. "Ginger ale, please. No ice." His voice was soft, marked by a slight lisp that somehow made him seem more approachable. The way he handled the glass when she set it down, carefully, despite his large hands, suggested someone who'd learned to control his strength. While Ruby served the newcomer, Carbone's pressure on Frank escalated. "You see, Mr. Kowalski, our records show you owe $47,000 in penalties and late fees. Quite a sum for someone on Social Security." Frank's face paled. 47,000. That's impossible. I've never missed a payment in 30 years. Complex financial instruments can be difficult to understand, Carbone replied with false sympathy. But the beauty of our offer is that all these penalties can be forgiven if you simply sign tonight. The stranger's eyes followed the confrontation. In the bar mirror, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly as he watched Carbone manipulate the elderly man. Ruby noticed his hands had tightened around the ginger ale glass. Dorothy tried to intervene, showing her own papers. "These documents you sent me contain the same language, the same false claims. This is harassment. Mrs. Martinez, I'd suggest you focus on your own situation rather than interfering in business that doesn't concern you." Carbone's dismissal carried the casual cruelty of someone who viewed elderly people as obstacles rather than human beings. Earl stood up slowly, his formal dignity intact despite the threat. "Young man, I've been in business longer than you've been alive. These papers are fraudulent, and your behavior is criminal." Sal Romano, Carbone's second piece of muscle, moved away from the window to push Earl back into his seat. The elderly man stumbled slightly, catching himself against the bar with quiet dignity intact but clearly shaken. In the mirror, Ruby saw the stranger's reflection change. Something shifted in his posture, a tension that hadn't been there before. His eyes, she realized, weren't just kind. They were intelligent, watchful, and now very focused on what was happening to Earl. "Please," Ruby said quietly, moving toward the confrontation. "No trouble in here. These are good people." Carbone ignored her, turning back to Frank with growing impatience. "Last chance, Mr. Kowalski. Sign these papers now, or tomorrow you'll be dealing with sheriff's deputies and eviction notices." Frank looked around the tavern, at Dorothy's encouraging nod, at Earl's dignified defiance, at Ruby's protective stance. The old man's hands shook, but his voice was steady. "No, I won't sign anything until my nephew reviews it." "You're making a big mistake, old man." Carbone's facade finally cracked completely. Without warning, he grabbed Frank's beer and poured it over the elderly man's head, the amber liquid soaking into his gray hair and running down his lined face. Dorothy gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Earl started to rise again, anger overriding caution. Ruby stepped forward, her protective instincts flaring. But it was the stranger's reflection that drew her attention. In the bar mirror, she could see him turning around on his stool, his movements deliberate and controlled. The baseball cap came off slowly, revealing a face that had been on magazine covers and pay-per-view events for decades. Even with the passage of time, even with the scars and the softer edges of middle age, there was no mistaking Mike Tyson. "That's enough," he said quietly, his voice cutting through the tavern with absolute authority. All conversation stopped, as every eye in Murphy's tavern turned toward the voice. Mike Tyson stood slowly from his stool, his movements deliberate and controlled, like a predator that had decided to stop hiding. The faded Yankees cap fell forgotten to the bar as he revealed the face that had struck fear into heavyweight contenders for decades. Recognition dawned in stages across the room. Ruby's eyes widened first, then Dorothy's hand covered her heart, and Earl straightened with something approaching awe. Even Carbone's confidence wavered as Tommy DeLuca whispered urgently in his ear, "Boss, that's..." The man said no, Mike said, stepping closer to where Frank sat with beard dripping from his gray hair. "That means no." Carbone tried to maintain his composure, but his voice carried a tremor that hadn't been there before. "This is a private business matter. You have no legal standing to interfere." Mike's dark eyes fixed on Carbone with the same intensity that had intimidated opponents in the ring. "Pouring a drink on a senior citizen? That's everybody's business." The tavern felt charged with electricity, the air thick with potential violence. Mike moved with the careful grace of a former athlete, managing age, but underneath the measured steps was the coiled power that had made him the youngest heavyweight champion in history. Tommy DeLuca, either braver or stupider than his partner, rushed Mike with the reckless confidence of youth-facing legend. It was a mistake that lasted exactly 3 seconds. Mike's first punch, a lightning-fast left hook, caught Tommy in the ribs, doubling him over. The second, a devastating uppercut, lifted the younger man off his feet before depositing him unconscious on Murphy's worn wooden floor. Sal Romano, seeing his partner crumpled and motionless, drew a knife from his jacket. "Back off, old man," or he never finished the threat. Mike moved with the ring intelligence that had made him famous, slipping inside Sal's guard and delivering a single, perfectly placed right cross that sent the knife spinning across the floor and Sal crashing into a table of empty chairs. Carbone found himself alone, his muscle neutralized, facing the most feared fighter in boxing history. Mike grabbed him by the lapels of his expensive suit and lifted him easily, bringing their faces close enough that Carbone could see the cold fury in the champion's eyes. "Here's how this works," Mike said, his voice deadly calm. "You're going to leave now. You're not coming back. And if I hear about you bothering these good people again, we're going to have a longer conversation. Do we understand each other?" Carbone nodded frantically, his earlier arrogance completely evaporated. Mike set him down almost gently, then gestured toward his unconscious employees. "Take your boys and go." As Carbone dragged his semi-conscious muscle toward the door, he tried to salvage some dignity with empty threats. "This isn't over. I have lawyers. I have connections. I'll be back with real professionals." The door slammed behind them, and for a moment, Murphy's Tavern sat in stunned silence. Then Frank began to laugh, a sound of pure relief and joy. Dorothy applauded, tears streaming down her face. Earl raised his whiskey glass in a toast to the man who had just defended their honor. Mike, embarrassed by the attention, settled back onto his stool and looked at Ruby with the shy smile of someone unused to being thanked for doing what felt natural. "Could I get another ginger ale?" he asked quietly. This one got warm. The tavern erupted in cheers and laughter, but through the front window, a black sedan with tinted windows sat across the street, engine running, its occupants watching and waiting. Ruby refused Mike's money when he tried to pay for his drinks, waving away his bills with a firm shake of her head. "Heroes don't pay at Murphy's," she declared, and the assembled regulars voiced their agreement with enthusiastic nods and raised glasses. Frank, still drying beer from his hair with Ruby's bar towel, couldn't stop talking about Mike's fights from the 80s. "I watched you destroy Spinks on that little TV over there," he said, pointing to the corner where an old television sat silent. 91 seconds. The whole neighborhood was here, cheering like we'd won the lottery. Dorothy produced a napkin from her purse, asking Mike to sign it for her grandson. "He's studying boxing history in school," she explained, though her pride suggested the boy would treasure anything connected to this moment regardless of his curriculum. Earl, ever formal, stood and offered his hand. "Mr. Tyson, it's an honor to meet a true champion, not just in the ring, but in character." Mike accepted the handshake with genuine humility, clearly uncomfortable with the praise. "Just call me Mike. And I'm not sure about the character part. I've made plenty of mistakes." "We all have," Earl replied. "What matters is what you do when good people need help." As the celebration continued, Mike learned more about the systematic nature of Carbone's operation. Frank explained how the harassment had been building for months. Official-looking letters, surprise inspections, mysterious fees and penalties that appeared overnight on previously clean accounts. "It's not just us," Dorothy added, her seamstresses. Attention to detail evident as she organized the various documents she'd received. Maria Santos lost her husband's bakery building last month. Same papers, same threats. Carl Jensen's apartment got condemned over gas leaks that the real inspector said didn't exist. Ruby leaned against the bar, her maternal instincts clearly engaged. They're targeting elderly property owners throughout the neighborhood. People on fixed incomes who can't afford lawyers to fight back. Mike studied the pattern, his years navigating business negotiations evident in the strategic questions he asked. How many properties? What's the timeline? Are they working alone or with city officials? Earl's business experience showed. In his analysis, at least 12 buildings in a 6-block radius over the past 8 months. Always elderly owners. Always the same legal intimidation tactics. Always rushed deadlines to prevent proper review. Been staying at a halfway house about 6 blocks from here, Mike said quietly, explaining his presence in the neighborhood. Part of my getting things back together. Found this place a couple weeks ago. Peaceful. Good people. Reminds me why I fell in love with New York. His honesty about his struggles seemed to deepen the connection with his new friends. These weren't people who judged others for past mistakes. They understood that life knocked everyone down sometimes, and what mattered was getting back up. Been coming in daily for ginger ale and quiet, Mike continued, finding solace in the routine, the unpretentious atmosphere, real people being real. As evening approached and the regulars prepared to leave, Mike offered to walk Dorothy and Earl home. The gesture was both protective and practical. Carbone's threats still hung in the air like smoke. Will we see you tomorrow? Frank asked, as they gathered their belongings. Mike nodded without hesitation. Wouldn't miss it. But as they exited Murphy's into the cool evening air, Ruby noticed what Mike had already spotted, the black sedan across the street, engine running, tinted windows reflecting the streetlights like dead eyes. Mike said nothing, but positioned himself between the car and his elderly companions as they walked into the gathering darkness. The next afternoon, Mike arrived at Murphy's Tavern earlier than usual to find Dorothy already seated at her customary table, but she wasn't alone. 3 other elderly residents had joined her, their faces carrying the same mixture of worry and determination he'd seen the night before. Maria Santos, 74, clutched a manila folder against her chest like armor. Her late husband's bakery had been her pride for 40 years before Apex Development claimed she owed 3 years of back rent to a company she'd never heard of. Carl Jensen, 68, sat with the hollow-eyed exhaustion of someone who hadn't slept properly in weeks, facing eviction from the apartment where he'd lived for 2 decades. Rose Kelly, 71, dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, still mourning the barbershop that had been her late husband's legacy before mysterious tax liens made it disappear. They've all got the same story, Dorothy said as Mike settled at the bar with his ginger ale. Same paperwork, same threats, same impossible deadlines. Ruby spread the documents across the table like a grim jigsaw puzzle. Each case showed the same sophisticated pattern: falsified debt claims, manufactured code violations, mysterious tax liens that appeared overnight. The legal language was complex enough to confuse victims, official enough to seem legitimate, but consistent enough to reveal the systematic nature of the fraud. They target people with no relatives nearby, Maria explained, her voice still carrying traces of her late husband's Mexican accent. People who can't afford lawyers, who trust authority, who get scared by official papers. Mike studied the timeline Ruby had constructed, his business experience helping him identify the vulnerabilities being exploited. Apex Development attacked when people were most isolated. Recent widows, elderly men without children nearby, seniors whose adult children lived in other states. It's not random, he observed. They research targets, wait for the right moment, then coordinate legal attacks from multiple angles. This is organized crime using bureaucracy as a weapon. Carl Jensen's story illustrated the pattern perfectly. His apartment had been condemned after an anonymous tip about gas leaks. When he demanded an inspection, the real city inspector found nothing wrong, but by then, Apex's paperwork had already moved through the system, and reversing the condemnation would require lawyers he couldn't afford. Rose Kelly's situation was even more heartbreaking. The barbershop her husband had run for 30 years was seized for back taxes that she'd actually paid. When she produced canceled checks as proof, Apex claimed the payments had been applied to the wrong account due to a clerical error that would take months to resolve, months she didn't have. They've stolen 6 buildings in our neighborhood alone, Earl said, arriving with news that made Mike's blood run cold. And now they've got my store. The elderly man's formal dignity remained intact, but underneath Mike could see the grief of someone who'd lost everything he'd worked 40 years to build. Earl had arrived that morning to find sheriff's deputies, court orders, and new locks on the grocery store that had been his life's work. $23,000 in penalties, Earl continued, his voice steady despite the devastation. For violations they claim I accumulated over 3 years. Documentation I've never seen. Fees I've never heard of. Penalties for code violations that don't exist. Ruby poured Earl a whiskey without being asked, her hands shaking slightly with suppressed rage. The store seizure represented an escalation. Carbone wasn't just threatening anymore. He was actually stealing properties while the community watched helplessly. Mike realized they'd moved past harassment into active theft. The confrontation at Murphy's had accelerated Carbone's timeline, and now innocent people were paying the price for Mike's intervention. "This stops now," he said, his voice carrying the authority that had once commanded heavyweight divisions. "You're not fighting this alone anymore." But even as he spoke, Ruby's phone rang with news that would change everything. She answered, with her usual cheerful Murphy's Tavern. Then her face went pale as she listened to the voice on the other end. "Earl," she said quietly, hanging up the phone. "That was Mrs. Patterson next door. They're putting papers on your apartment door. Right now? Eviction notice. You've got 72 hours. That evening, Mike walked Earl to see his seized store, their footsteps echoing off the empty sidewalk as they approached what had been the heart of Earl's life for 4 decades. The windows were already papered over with official notices bearing Apex Development's logo, and a private security guard stood outside like a sentinel guarding stolen treasure. Mike approached with deliberate calm, his hands visible and non-threatening. "I'd like to speak with someone about this seizure." The guard, a young man who clearly recognized Mike despite trying to appear nonchalant, nervously reached for his radio. Mr. Tyson? I need to call my supervisor." Within 10 minutes, Joey Martino arrived in a black SUV. Unlike Carbone's obvious muscle, Martino carried himself with professional authority. Expensive suit, measured movements, the bearing of someone who understood both business and violence. "Mr. Tyson," Martino said, extending his hand with calculated courtesy. "Joey Martino, Apex Development Security Coordinator. I understand you have questions about this property seizure." Mike accepted the handshake, noting Martino's firm grip and direct eye contact. This wasn't another Tommy DeLuca. This was someone who'd been chosen for his competence, not just his muscle. "I'd like to see the documentation supporting this seizure," Mike said. "Mr. Patterson has been a model business owner for 40 years. Martino produced a tablet, scrolling through legal filings with the efficiency of someone who'd done this before. "Everything's completely legal, Mr. Tyson. Court orders, tax liens, penalty assessments, all properly filed and processed through appropriate channels." The documentation was sophisticated enough to withstand casual scrutiny, but Mike's experience with business contracts helped him spot the subtle inconsistencies that suggested fraud. The problem was proving it would require lawyers, time, and resources that Earl didn't have. "Apex has friends in city government," Martino continued, his tone suggesting this information should be taken as a warning. "People who understand that progress sometimes requires difficult decisions. I'd suggest you shouldn't get involved in matters you don't understand." Earl stood silently beside Mike, his dignity intact but his grief visible as he looked at the store that had been his life's work. 40 years of serving the community, reduced to legal paperwork and private security guards. As they talked, an unmarked police car pulled up to the curb. Detective Ray Molina emerged with the official bearing of law enforcement, but Mike noticed the stress lines around his eyes and the tension in his movements. "Mr. Tyson," Molina said, approaching with calculated authority, "I need to see some identification." Mike complied, producing his ID while studying the detective's demeanor. Molina had the look of a cop who'd seen too much and compromised too often, still fundamentally decent, but carrying the weight of impossible choices. "I've received complaints about your behavior yesterday at Murphy's Tavern," Molina continued, producing a folder with Mike's name on it. "Assault, making terroristic threats, interfering with legitimate business operations. I stopped elderly people from being harassed," Mike replied evenly. "Everything I did was in defense of others." "That's not how Mr. Carbone remembers it." Molina handed Mike a court summons with the mechanical efficiency of someone following orders he didn't particularly like. "You're to appear tomorrow morning on charges of third-degree assault and criminal mischief." Mike studied the summons, recognizing the trap that had been laid for him. Carbone had anticipated retaliation and prepared legal countermeasures designed to neutralize Mike's intervention. "I'd suggest you stay away from Murphy's Tavern and anyone connected to this business dispute," Molina continued, "for your own good." As the detective drove away, Mike realized the scope of what he was facing. This wasn't just neighborhood bullying. It was organized criminal enterprise with law enforcement protection. Carbone had judges, cops, and city officials in his pocket, turning the legal system into a weapon against the elderly victims. Earl touched Mike's arm gently. "You don't have to fight this battle for us, Mike. We understand if you need to protect yourself." But as Mike looked at the papered-over windows of Earl's stolen store, at the security guard protecting stolen property, at the legal documents designed to make theft appear legitimate, he felt the same cold fury that had driven him to boxing. "Greatness. Nobody steals from my friends," he said quietly. Nobody. That night, across the street from Murphy's Tavern, the black sedan returned to its watching position, engine running, waiting for morning to bring the next phase of Vincent Carbone's carefully orchestrated plan. Queen's Criminal Court felt like a machine designed to process people rather than deliver justice. Mike arrived at 8 in the morning to find his public defender, a harried young woman named Jennifer Walsh, clutching a coffee and a case file she'd clearly received 30 minutes earlier. "Mr. Tyson, I'm afraid I haven't had much time to review your case," she admitted, scanning papers while walking toward the courtroom. "The charges are serious: third-degree assault, menacing, and criminal mischief. The complainant is claiming permanent injury." Mike studied the courtroom as they entered, noting the worn benches, fluorescent lighting, and institutional atmosphere that made everyone feel guilty regardless of their actual crimes. Judge Patricia Morgan presided with the efficient coldness of someone who'd processed thousands of similar cases. "Your Honor," the prosecutor began, "Mr. Tyson has a documented history of violence. The complainant, Mr. Thomas DeLuca, suffered severe injuries requiring medical attention after Mr. Tyson's unprovoked attack." Jennifer Walsh tried to object, but Judge Morgan cut her off with practiced indifference. "Mr. Tyson, your reputation speaks for itself. This court has no tolerance for individuals who use their physical advantages to intimidate law-abiding citizens." Mike watched the proceedings with growing understanding of how thoroughly the fix was in. Tommy DeLuca appeared in court with a neck brace and theatrical limping, claiming permanent damage from what had been a simple knockout punch. Carbone's attorney presented witness statements and security footage that Mike had never seen being recorded. "Your Honor," Mike tried to explain, "these elderly residents were being harassed and threatened. I was defending Mr. Tyson." Judge Morgan interrupted. "Your history of violent behavior is well documented. This court will not allow you to use vigilante justice as an excuse for assault." The restraining order was granted with mechanical efficiency, banning Mike from Murphy's Tavern and a 4-block radius around it. The message was clear: Carbone had prepared for this exact scenario, using the legal system to remove Mike from the equation. As Mike exited the courthouse, he expected to see the morning sunshine and normal Queens traffic. Instead, Detective Ray Molina waited beside his unmarked car with 2 uniformed officers and a fresh set of handcuffs. "Mr. Tyson," Molina said, his voice carrying the mechanical tone of someone following orders he didn't necessarily agree with, "you're under arrest for extortion and conspiracy to commit assault." Mike's hands were cuffed behind his back as Molina read him his rights, but his attention was focused on the black sedan parked across the street. Vincent Carbone stood beside it, talking on his phone and watching the arrest with obvious satisfaction. "New evidence has come to light," Molina explained as they walked toward the police car. "Witness statements, recordings, documentation of your threats against Mr. Carbone and his employees." A news van rounded the corner just as Mike was placed. In the back seat, its camera crew clearly alerted in advance to capture footage of the former heavyweight champion being arrested. The headlines would write themselves: "Former heavyweight champion arrested in extortion scheme." As the police car pulled away from the courthouse, Mike caught a glimpse of Murphy's Tavern in the distance. Through the rear window, he could see Ruby's worried face in the doorway, Dorothy and Earl standing beside her, watching their champion being taken away. Carbone had anticipated everything: Mike's intervention, his protective instincts, even his willingness to help the elderly residents. The elaborate legal trap had been designed specifically to neutralize Mike's ability to interfere, leaving the community more vulnerable than ever. From his position in the back seat, Mike couldn't see Carbone making another phone call, couldn't hear him giving orders to accelerate the timeline. With Mike removed from the equation, The elderly residents of Murphy's neighborhood had 48 hours before the final phase of Apex Development's systematic theft would be complete. The trap had been sprung perfectly, and Vincent Carbone's confidence had never been higher. He had no way of knowing that Mike Tyson's greatest victories had always come after his darkest defeats, or that removing him from the neighborhood would only make him more dangerous, not less. Rikers Island Detention Center processed Mike Tyson with the same institutional efficiency it applied to every other arrestee, but the recognition was immediate and unmistakable. Corrections officers who'd grown up watching his fights treated him with a mixture of professional detachment and barely concealed awe, while other inmates sized him up with the complex calculus of prison hierarchy. Sergeant Williams, a 60-year-old black man whose graying temples and careful bearing suggested decades of experience managing difficult situations, approached Mike's holding cell with measured respect. "Mike Tyson," he said, shaking his head slowly. "Never thought I'd see the day. Watched every one of your fights back in the 80s. What the hell are you doing in here?" "Wrong place, wrong time," Mike replied quietly, settling onto the narrow bench. "Or maybe right place, right time, depending on how you look at it." The one phone call policy felt like cruel irony. 48 hours to make one connection to the outside world while Carbone's operation accelerated without interference. Mike dialed Murphy's Tavern, praying Ruby would answer instead of some automated system. "Murphy's." Ruby's voice carried exhaustion and stress that hadn't been there 2 days ago. "Ruby, it's Mike." "How are, Mike?" "Thank God. It's bad here. Real bad." Her voice cracked with emotion. "They came back an hour after the news reported your arrest. Frank's in the hospital. Chest pains when they served him eviction papers. Dorothy's building got condemned for safety violations that appeared overnight. Earl's staying at my place because he's got nowhere else to go." Mike closed his eyes, feeling the weight of every decision that had led to this moment. His intervention had protected the elderly residents for exactly 24 hours before Carbone's revenge made their situation worse than ever. "They know you can't help us now," Ruby continued. "They're moving fast, Mike. Faster than we can fight. I'm going to fix this," Mike said, though he had no idea how. "Take care of each other. Don't sign anything. I'll find a way." The call ended with the mechanical click of institutional limitation, leaving Mike alone with the knowledge that his 48-hour hold gave Carbone a clear window to complete his theft without interference. Dinner in the common area brought its own challenges. Younger inmates tested him with the swagger of youth facing legend, while older prisoners treated him with the reverence reserved for sports heroes who'd represented something greater than themselves. Mike navigated the complex social dynamics with quiet confidence, earning respect without seeking confrontation. Iron Mike Tyson. The voice belonged to Lou Benedetto, a compact 67-year-old man whose quick hands and knowing eyes immediately marked him as boxing family. "I trained fighters who sparred with you back in the day. Lou Benedetto, I run the recreation program here." Mike shook the offered hand, feeling the calluses of someone who'd spent decades wrapping fighters' hands and working heavy bags. "Lou, good to meet you. Heard about your situation through the grapevine," Lou said, lowering his voice as they moved toward the corner of the common area. 40 years in boxing, you meet everyone. Trainers, managers, promoters, even some reporters who covered the sport. Kevin Rooney still remembers what you meant to him. Jimmy Jacobs' widow still respects your name. Mike realized that his boxing legacy had created relationships extending far beyond the ring. A network of people who might help if they knew he needed it. "You need something on the outside?" Lou asked. "I might know some people who remember when you were more than just headlines." The jail's gymnasium smelled of old sweat, worn leather, and the particular mixture of hope and desperation that marked places where people tried to change their lives through physical discipline. Lou Benedetto's boxing program operated on donated equipment and volunteer hours, but the dedication was genuine. Young inmates learning to channel aggression into technique. Older men coaching with the patience of those who'd found redemption through sport. Mike watched a training session with the critical eye of someone who'd spent decades perfecting the science of boxing. The fundamentals were solid despite the limited resources. Lou clearly knew what he was doing. 40 years in this business teaches you that boxing isn't just about fighting, Lou explained as they observed a sparring session. It's about discipline, respect, finding something worth protecting. These kids need that more than they need perfect equipment. Mike nodded, understanding the deeper purpose. What kind of network are we talking about? Lou's explanation revealed the interconnected world of boxing that most people never saw. Trainers who'd worked with multiple generations of fighters, managers who'd stayed loyal through ups and downs, reporters who'd covered the sport for decades. People who remembered when boxing meant something beyond entertainment. Kevin Rooney's been making calls since he heard about your situation, Lou said. There's a reporter named Alex Morrison from the Queen's Gazette who's been investigating this Apex development outfit for months. Problem is, he needs victims willing to go on record, and most people are too scared. Mike realized his arrest might have provided the catalyst Morrison needed, a high-profile case that would force media attention on Carbone's systematic elder abuse. Can you get a message to them? Mike asked. Already working on it. But there's something else. Lou gestured toward a young man, working the heavy bag with raw talent, but no technical foundation. Marcus Williams, 19, Ruby's nephew. Just got out last week. Been asking about you. Mike studied Marcus, athletic build, quick hands, anger being channeled into punches, but no real understanding of boxing fundamentals. The kid had potential, but more importantly, he had family connections to the community Carbone was destroying. Marcus, Mike called out. Let me see your stance. The young man approached with a mixture of respect and skepticism that marked someone who'd heard legends, but never seen them proven. Mike spent 20 minutes teaching basic footwork, using the lesson to process his own situation. Boxing ain't about being the strongest, Mike explained as Marcus learned to maintain balance. While moving, it's about being smart, staying mobile, protecting yourself while you find your opening. The metaphor applied to more than boxing. Carbone thought he'd neutralized Mike by removing him from the neighborhood, but isolation might actually provide advantages. Time to think strategically, access to resources Carbone couldn't monitor, connections the developer didn't know existed. That evening, Lou returned with news that changed everything. Your message is out. Kevin Rooney's already coordinating with this Morrison reporter. And there's something else you need to know. Lou lowered his voice as they moved to a corner where their conversation couldn't be overheard. Word from my network is that Detective Molina isn't completely dirty. Supposedly he's being blackmailed. They got something on his kid, using it to force cooperation. But there's also talk that the feds have been watching Apex development for months. Mike felt the first stirring of hope since his arrest. If Molina was being coerced rather than bought, he might be turned. If federal investigators were already building a case, Mike's situation might provide the catalyst they needed to move. From observation to action. There's more, Lou continued. This Morrison reporter's been documenting Apex's pattern across 12 neighborhoods. Same methods, same targets, same corruption. Your elderly friends aren't the only victims. This is much bigger than one tavern in Queens. Mike realized Carbone's operation represented exactly the kind of systematic elder abuse that would attract federal attention. The challenge was connecting the pieces before Carbone completed his theft and disappeared with the profits. Can your people get a message to Morrison? Mike asked. Tell him to look into Detective Molina's situation. If we can flip Molina, we might have a chance to stop this thing. Murphy's Tavern felt like a funeral home as Ruby served drinks to a crowd diminished by fear and circumstance. The comfortable familiarity that had defined the place for decades was gone, replaced by the hollow atmosphere of a community under siege. Many regular customers stayed away, afraid that association with the tavern would make them targets. Dorothy sat alone at her usual table, but instead of her customary wine, she studied legal documents through a magnifying glass, trying to decipher the eviction notice she'd received that morning. The building she'd called home for 15 years had been condemned for structural violations that hadn't existed the previous week. Safety hazards discovered during routine inspection, she read aloud, her voice carrying the bitter irony of someone who understood she was being cheated but couldn't prove it. Immediate evacuation required pending costly repairs. Ruby poured herself a cup of coffee instead of her usual evening glass of wine. She needed to stay sharp for whatever was coming next. Earl sat at the end of the bar where he'd held court for years, but now he looked diminished, a man who'd lost everything he'd worked 40 years to build. Frank's still in the hospital, Ruby reported, hanging up the phone after checking with the cardiac unit. Anxiety attack, they're calling. It, 72 years old, never had heart problems before these bastards started threatening him. Earl sipped his whiskey with the careful movements of someone conserving strength. 40 years I ran that store. Served 3 generations of families. Never thought I'd see the day when criminals could steal everything legal-like. Despite their losses, the core group was beginning to organize. Dorothy's attention to detail proved invaluable as she compared documents, spotting patterns in the fake legal paperwork. Earl's business experience helped them understand the financial mechanisms being used against them. Ruby's Tavern provided an unofficial headquarters despite the looming threat of closure. "Look at this," Dorothy said, spreading papers across her table. Same letterhead on all the violation notices. Same inspector's signature. Same rush timeline. But the violations described don't match the actual buildings. "They're using a template," Earl observed. "Changing names and addresses, but keeping the same fabricated violations. Efficient, but sloppy if you know what to look for." Ruby felt a surge of pride watching these elderly residents transform from victims into investigators. They might not have lawyers or political connections, but they had decades of life experience and the clarity that came from having nothing left to lose. "We need to document everything," Dorothy said, her seamstress's organizational skills evident as she created files for each victim. Names, dates, which officials signed which papers. If there's a pattern, maybe someone will listen. Their planning was interrupted by an official knock at the tavern door. Ruby opened it to find Vincent Carbone flanked by a building inspector, carrying a clipboard and wearing the bored expression of someone being paid to reach predetermined conclusions. "Ms. Wilson," Carbone said with false courtesy, "I'm afraid there's been a complaint about this establishment. Safety violations, health code issues, structural problems. Mr. Patterson here needs to conduct an immediate inspection." The inspector moved through Murphy's with perfunctory efficiency, taking photos of violations that existed only in his imagination. Electrical problems he couldn't explain, structural damage he couldn't point to, health hazards he couldn't identify specifically. 72 hours, Carbone announced as the inspector finished his theatrical performance. "That's how long you have to shut down voluntarily. After that, the city will close you permanently and file criminal charges for operating an unsafe establishment." Ruby felt her world crumbling as she realized they were about to lose their meeting place, their headquarters, their last safe space in a neighborhood being systematically destroyed. After Carbone left, Earl raised his glass in a toast that carried more defiance than despair. To Murphy's Tavern. To good people fighting impossible odds. To that young man, Mike, who said this stops now. Dorothy lifted her water glass, tears streaming down her face, but her voice steady. "Even if he can't help us from jail, maybe we can help ourselves." Ruby locked the tavern door and turned to face her friends, battered but not broken, afraid but not surrendering. 48 hours until they shut us down. What do we do? "We fight," Earl said simply. "However we can, for as long as we can." Kevin Rooney's apartment in Brooklyn had become an unlikely war room by early morning of Mike's 3rd day in jail. The 68-year-old former trainer sat across from Alex Morrison, an investigative reporter whose rumpled appearance and intense focus marked him as someone who'd spent months chasing a story that kept growing larger and more complex. "I've been tracking Apex development for 8 months, Morrison explained, spreading files across Kevin's kitchen table. 12 neighborhoods, over 100 elderly victims, systematic theft disguised as legal proceedings. But every time I get close to publication, my sources disappear or city officials block access to records." Kevin studied the documentation with the methodical approach of someone who'd spent decades analyzing opponents' weaknesses. "Mike's situation gives you something you didn't have before, a high-profile victim who can't be intimidated into silence." Morrison nodded grimly. "Carbone's made a tactical error. He's used to elderly victims who can be scared into compliance. But Mike Tyson in jail for defending senior citizens? That's a story that writes itself, and it forces attention on the entire operation." They drove to Murphy's Tavern just as Ruby was posting the closure notice on the front door. The sight of the neighborhood's last gathering place being shut down crystallized the scope of Carbone's systematic destruction. "Mrs. Wilson?" Morrison approached with the careful courtesy of a reporter who understood trauma. I'm Alex Morrison from the Queen's Gazette. I've been investigating Apex development for months. Would you be willing to talk? Ruby studied Morrison's press credentials, then looked at Kevin. You know Mike? Trained him for 3 years, Kevin said simply. He asked me to help. Inside Murphy's, Morrison interviewed Ruby, Dorothy, and Earl with the thoroughness of someone building a legal case rather than just writing a newspaper story. His questions revealed that Apex's methods were even more sophisticated than the elderly residents had realized. The pattern extends across Queens, Morrison explained. Apex targets elderly property owners using a network of corrupt officials, building inspectors, court clerks, even some judges. They've perfected a system of legal theft that's almost impossible to challenge through normal channels. Dorothy's organizational skills proved invaluable as she presented her documented timeline of Apex's activities. Earl's business experience helped Morrison understand the financial mechanisms being exploited. Ruby's customer relationships provided connections to victims throughout the affected neighborhoods. The problem is proof, Morrison continued. I have documentation, witness statements, evidence of the pattern. But Carbone has political protection and enough legal cover to make prosecution difficult. Back at Rikers, Lou brought Mike disturbing intelligence from his boxing network. Word is that Detective Molina's being blackmailed over his son. Kid got arrested for drugs, but there's more to the story. Supposedly the evidence was planted, and Molina's cooperation keeps the charges from being filed. Mike realized Molina's situation might provide the leverage needed to flip him. A corrupt cop could be bought, but a desperate father protecting his child could be reached through different means. There's something else, Lou continued, lowering his voice as they moved to a corner of the gym. Federal investigators have been building a case against Apex for months. Your situation might be the catalyst they need to move from surveillance to action. Mike understood the implications. If federal agents were already investigating Apex's operation, his arrest and the acceleration of the elder abuse might provide the evidence they needed to take down the entire network. Can your people get a message to Morrison? Mike asked. Tell him to investigate Molina's situation carefully. If we can document the blackmail, we might be able to turn him. And tell Morrison to look for federal interest. If the feds are watching, they might be willing to coordinate with local efforts. Lou nodded, understanding the strategic value of connecting all the pieces. Your friends at Murphy's are stronger than they look. They're organizing, documenting, building a case even without legal help. Mike felt a surge of pride mixed with urgent concern. The elderly residents were proving they wouldn't surrender without a fight, but time was running out. In 24 hours, he'd be released or transferred, and Carbone would complete his systematic theft of the neighborhood. Everything depended on whether Morrison could build enough pressure to force action before Apex Development disappeared with their stolen properties and illegal profits. The real fight was just beginning. Detective Ray Molina sat in his unmarked police car outside Lincoln High School, watching his 16-year-old son Danny walk toward basketball practice with the easy confidence of a teenager who believed the world made sense. Ray's hands gripped the steering wheel as his phone buzzed with another text from Vincent Carbone. Hope Danny's enjoying his senior year. Would hate for those drug possession charges to resurface. Ray deleted the message with shaking fingers, just as he'd deleted dozens of others over the past 8 months. Each text was a reminder of the impossible choice Carbone had forced on him: protect his son or protect innocent elderly residents. There had never really been a choice. The memory of Danny's arrest played in Ray's mind like a recurring nightmare. A routine traffic stop had escalated when the arresting officer discovered marijuana in Danny's backpack, a small amount that should have resulted in community service and counseling. But within hours, additional drugs had been found in Danny's school locker, transforming a misdemeanor into a felony that could destroy the boy's future. Ray had known immediately that something was wrong. Danny was a good kid, honor roll student, varsity athlete, college-bound. The planted evidence was sophisticated enough to fool a jury, but Ray's 20 years of police work had taught him to recognize a frame job. Then Carbone had made contact, offering a simple solution. The enhanced evidence would disappear, the charges would be reduced to a warning, and Danny's future would remain intact. All Ray had to do was provide occasional assistance with regulatory matters involving Apex Development Corporation. The assistants had started small, delayed responses to complaints, misfiled paperwork, bureaucratic obstacles for anyone trying to investigate Apex's activities. Ray had told himself he was just slowing things down, not really helping criminals. But as the months passed and the elderly victims multiplied, the weight of his complicity had become unbearable. Alex Morrison's approach came through unofficial channels, a cryptic phone call suggesting a meeting at a diner in Elmhurst, far from Carbone's usual territory. Ray almost didn't go, but something in Morrison's voice suggested the reporter knew more than he was saying. "Detective Molina," Morrison said, sliding into the booth across from him. "I think we need to talk about Danny." Ray's hand moved instinctively toward his service weapon before Morrison raised both hands peacefully. "I'm not here to threaten you. I'm here because I know your son was framed, and I think you want to stop the people who did it." Morrison spread photographs across the table, surveillance images of the arrest, copies of the planted evidence, documentation of Carbone's involvement in similar frame jobs across Queens. The reporter had been building a case for months, connecting Apex Development's elder abuse operation to a broader network of corruption. "The feds have been watching this for longer than you think," Morrison continued. "They know about Danny. They know about the blackmail, and they know you're not the real target. But they need your help to bring down the entire network." Ray studied the evidence with the analytical skills of a career detective, recognizing the systematic nature of Carbone's operation. The elder abuse wasn't just opportunistic crime. It was organized criminal enterprise using corruption and blackmail to create a network of complicit officials. "What do you need?" Ray asked quietly. "Everything you have on Apex Development. Dates, times, conversations, documentation. And most importantly, we need you to start recording your interactions with Carbone." Ray understood the implications. Cooperation meant risking Danny's safety if Carbone discovered the betrayal. But continuing to enable the systematic abuse of elderly residents meant sacrificing his soul to protect his son's future. "If I do this," Ray said, "can you guarantee Danny's protection?" Morrison nodded grimly. "Federal witness protection, if necessary. But detective, this is bigger than just your son now. Carbone's operation has destroyed dozens of families. How many more elderly people have to lose everything before someone stops him?" That evening, Ray sat across from Danny at their kitchen table, studying his son's face and wondering if protecting him was worth the cost in innocent lives. Murphy's Tavern hosted its final gathering with the somber atmosphere of a wake, though the person being mourned was the community itself. Ruby served drinks to the diminished crowd with hands that shook slightly. Tomorrow the city would padlock the doors, ending decades of neighborhood tradition and eliminating the last safe meeting place for the elderly residents Carbone was systematically destroying. Dorothy sat at her usual table, but her customary wine remained untouched as she organized the final batch of legal documents they'd collected. Frank had been released from the hospital that afternoon, still weak from his anxiety attack, but determined to join the others for this last gathering. Earl occupied his traditional spot at the bar's end, his formal dignity intact despite having lost everything he'd worked 40 years to build. "They've scheduled the final seizures for tomorrow," Dorothy reported, her seamstress's attention to detail evident in the timeline she'd constructed. 6 remaining properties, all with emergency court orders filed simultaneously. Ruby poured herself coffee instead of wine, needing to stay sharp for whatever was coming. Building inspector came by again this afternoon. Found 3 more violations that didn't exist this morning. "We've got until noon tomorrow before they physically remove us." The tavern door opened with the gentle chime that had welcomed neighbors for generations. But instead of another regular, Rose Kelly entered with tears streaming down her lined face. The 71-year-old widow clutched a manila envelope against her chest like armor, her small frame shaking with exhaustion and despair. "I signed," she said simply, collapsing into the chair Dorothy quickly pulled out for her. "I couldn't fight anymore. They wore me down until I just gave up." Ruby poured Rose a brandy without being asked, her maternal instincts recognizing someone who'd reached her breaking point. Rose had lost her husband's barbershop, 30 years of community tradition reduced to Carbone's legal manipulation and her own desperate signature on papers she didn't understand. "I held on to that shop for 3 years after Patrick died," Rose continued, her voice barely above a whisper. It was all I had left of him. The smell of aftershave, the old barber chairs, the photographs of neighborhood kids getting their first haircuts. Now it's gone because I was too scared and too stupid to fight. Instead of judgment, Rose received immediate support. Frank shared his own moments of despair when the eviction papers arrived. Dorothy talked about considering surrender when the building condemnation seemed insurmountable. Earl admitted he'd almost signed away his store before tearing up the papers in a moment of stubborn pride. "We've all thought about giving up," Earl said with gentle authority. "What matters is that we're here now, together, refusing to let them win without a fight." Their moment of solidarity was shattered by Ruby's phone ringing with news that would haunt them all. She answered with her usual Murphy's Tavern. Then her face went pale as she listened to the voice on the other end. "That was Mrs. Chun next door," Ruby said quietly after hanging up. "Carl Jensen is dead." The silence that followed felt like a physical weight. Carl Jensen, the 68-year-old facing eviction from his apartment, had been found dead in his kitchen from an apparent heart attack. The unofficial word was that Carbone's men had been pressuring him to sign papers when he collapsed, but they'd left him there and called it in an hour later. "Stressed to death," Frank said, his voice carrying the flat certainty of someone who understood exactly how fear could kill. "They murdered that man as sure as if they'd pulled a trigger." Earl stood slowly, raising his whiskey glass with the formal dignity that had made him a neighborhood patriarch. "Carl Jensen was a good man who deserved better. We all do. If we don't stop running scared, we'll all end up like Carl, stressed to death or forced out of our homes." The impromptu memorial transformed grief into determination. They shared stories about Carl's quiet kindness, his weekly visits to Murphy's, his gentle humor and dignity in the face of systematic harassment. He'd been one of them, working class, elderly, vulnerable to predators who saw his isolation as opportunity. Ruby locked Murphy's Tavern for the final time, the key turning with the finality of an ending. But as the elderly residents gathered their belongings, Dorothy made a proposal that surprised everyone. "My apartment is small, but it has a basement. If we're going to keep fighting, we need somewhere to meet." Earl nodded with approval. "Carl wouldn't want us to give up. He'd want us to fight for every person Carbone hasn't stolen from yet." As they walked into the cool evening air, Murphy's Tavern dark behind them, the group carried something they hadn't had before, the clarity that came from losing everything and discovering they still had each other. Carl Jensen's death had given them something Carbone couldn't steal, the understanding that surrender meant death and resistance meant life, regardless of the odds. The emergency motion filed by Morrison's federal contacts moved through the legal system with the efficiency that money and political pressure could provide when applied correctly. Mike's case file, which had seemed airtight the previous day, suddenly developed procedural problems that Judge Patricia Morgan couldn't ignore without risking her own federal investigation. Lou Benedetto brought the news to Mike during the morning boxing program. "Your legal situation's changing fast. The reporter Morrison has federal backing now. They're filing emergency motions to get you released today." Mike worked the heavy bag with controlled intensity, processing the implications of federal involvement while maintaining the routine that had kept him centered during 3 days of forced isolation. Each punch carried the frustration of watching his community suffer while he remained powerless to help. "There's more," Lou continued, lowering his voice as other inmates moved through their morning routines. "Morrison's federal contacts are providing evidence that your arrest was orchestrated using false testimony. That kid Tommy DeLuca has a history of filing fake assault claims, and the security footage was fabricated." The revelation didn't surprise Mike. He'd recognized the setup from the moment Carbone appeared with perfectly timed legal countermeasures. But federal involvement suggested the case was bigger than neighborhood harassment, potentially part of a broader investigation into systematic elder abuse. By afternoon, Mike found himself back in Queens criminal court, but this time the atmosphere was entirely different. Judge Morgan, facing her own federal scrutiny, had no choice but to review evidence that dismantled the prosecution's case with surgical precision. "Mr. Tyson," she said with obvious reluctance, "new evidence has come to light regarding the circumstances of your arrest. All charges are dismissed, and the restraining order is vacated pending further investigation." Mike exited the courthouse to find Kevin Rooney waiting with Alex Morrison, both men carrying the grim expressions of people bearing bad news alongside the good. "Mike," Kevin said, "we need to talk about Carl Jensen." The news of Carl's death hit Mike like a physical blow. The quiet, dignified man who'd faced eviction with such courage had been stressed to death, while Mike sat powerless in jail. The guilt was immediate and overwhelming. If Mike hadn't intervened at Murphy's, Carbone might have moved slower, and Carl might still be alive. "It's not your fault," Morrison said, recognizing Mike's reaction. "Carbone's operation was always going to escalate. Your intervention just forced him to show his true nature earlier." They drove to Dorothy's apartment, where Mike found the elderly residents gathered in her small living room with the determination of people who decided they had nothing left to lose. Frank looked older and frilier after his hospital stay, but his gentle eyes held steel that hadn't been there before. Earl sat with the formal dignity of someone who'd transformed grief into purpose. Ruby bustled around serving coffee with the maternal efficiency that had made Murphy's Tavern a home for so many. "Mike," Dorothy embraced him with the fierce affection of someone who'd feared she'd never see him again. "We knew you'd find a way back to us." The reunion was interrupted by an official knock at Dorothy's door. Detective Ray Molina stood outside, but his demeanor was entirely different from their previous encounters. The stress lines around his eyes had deepened, but there was something approaching relief in his bearing. "Mr. Tyson," Molina said, "I need to talk to all of you. It's about Carbone's operation." Inside Dorothy's living room, Molina revealed the federal investigation that had been building for months. Apex Development is part of a nationwide elder abuse network. They've stolen over $50 million in property across 3 states using the same methods you've experienced here. The detective's cooperation came with devastating news about Carbone's timeline. He knows about the federal investigation now. Word leaked from somewhere in the system. He's accelerating everything. All remaining properties will be seized tomorrow morning using emergency court orders filed simultaneously. After that, he disappears with the profits. Mike realized they had less than 18 hours to stop a criminal operation that had taken months to build and had government protection at multiple levels. The federal case would eventually succeed, but it would come too late to save the remaining elderly residents from losing everything. "We have documentation, witness statements, evidence of the pattern," Morrison added. "But Carbone's legal protection is sophisticated enough to delay prosecution for months." Earl raised his coffee cup in a toast that carried both determination and desperation. 18 hours to save our neighborhood. 18 hours to get justice for Carl Jensen. What do we do? Mike looked around Dorothy's living room at the faces of people who'd become family in the space of a week. They were asking him to lead a fight against systematic corruption with no resources except courage and the bonds they'd forged through shared adversity. "We stop him," Mike said simply. "Whatever it takes." Dorothy's living room transformed into a command center as Mike, the elderly residents, Morrison, and Detective Molina spread maps and documents across every available surface. The plan they developed was ambitious: coordinate multiple simultaneous actions to expose Carbone's operation so thoroughly that even his political protection couldn't suppress the evidence. Morrison publishes his investigation at dawn with federal backing, Mike outlined, his strategic thinking evident as he coordinated the complex operation. Molina provides recorded evidence of police corruption to federal investigators. "We organize peaceful resistance at each targeted property with media coverage documenting everything." The elderly residents would testify about their experiences, creating human faces for Morrison's investigation. Ruby coordinated communication networks. Dorothy organized documentation. Earl provided historical context about the neighborhood's value. Frank, despite his recent hospitalization, insisted on participating in the peaceful demonstrations. "The goal is overwhelming documentation," Morrison explained. "So much evidence from so many sources that Carbone's network can't suppress it all simultaneously." By dawn, everything seemed to proceed perfectly. Morrison's story broke in the morning news with federal backing, exposing Apex Development's systematic elder abuse across Queens. The investigation detailed the sophisticated legal manipulation, documented the network of corrupt officials, and provided compelling testimony from elderly victims. Detective Molina presented his recorded evidence to federal investigators, implicating city council members, building inspectors, and court clerks in Carbone's corruption network. The recordings revealed the systematic nature of the blackmail and bribery that had made Apex's operation possible. Mike led peaceful demonstrations at each targeted property, drawing massive media coverage as the former heavyweight champion defended elderly residents from systematic theft. The imagery was powerful, a boxing legend protecting vulnerable seniors from corporate predators using legal manipulation. By afternoon, the victory seemed complete. Several city officials resigned, in scandal to avoid federal charges. Judge Patricia Morgan recused herself from all Apex-related cases pending investigation. Emergency injunctions halted all pending property seizures. Mike gave emotional interviews about protecting elderly communities, and the story achieved national coverage. The elderly residents celebrated at Dorothy's apartment, believing they'd won through coordination and courage. Frank hugged Mike with tears in his eyes. Dorothy organized their documentation with pride. Earl raised champagne in a toast to their unlikely victory. "We did it," Ruby said, embracing Mike with the fierce affection of someone who'd never doubted their eventual success. "We actually stopped them." Their celebration was interrupted by the sound of cars pulling up outside Dorothy's building. Through the window, they could see federal agents emerging from black SUVs with the official bearing of law enforcement conducting a planned operation. The knock at Dorothy's door carried the authority of federal warrants. Agent Sarah Martinez entered with a team of investigators, but their target wasn't Vincent Carbone, it was Mike Tyson. "Mr. Tyson," Martinez said, producing handcuffs and federal arrest warrants. "You're under arrest for racketeering, conspiracy, and organizing a criminal enterprise to interfere with legitimate business operations." Mike's hands were cuffed behind his back as Martinez read federal charges that painted his community organizing as criminal conspiracy. Morrison's investigation was dismissed as compromised by collaboration with organized criminal activity. Molina's evidence was rejected as fabricated by co-conspirators seeking to avoid prosecution. The devastating twist was revealed as they led Mike toward the federal vehicles. Vincent Carbone appeared on the evening news with his lawyer, explaining that he'd been cooperating with federal investigators for months, recording conversations and documenting what he described as a criminal conspiracy led by Mike Tyson to extort legitimate businesses. Carbone had anticipated every aspect of their resistance, turning their coordination into evidence of criminal organization. His immunity deal with federal prosecutors was ironclad. In exchange for testifying against the Tyson conspiracy, all charges against Apex Development would be dropped. As federal agents loaded Mike into their vehicle, Carbone called Dorothy's apartment personally. Ruby answered with shaking hands as the elderly residents watched their champion being taken away again. "Tell your friends they have until noon tomorrow to vacate all properties voluntarily." Carbone's voice carried triumph and finality, "or I'll have them arrested as co-conspirators. Mr. Tyson can't protect you from federal prison." The line went dead, leaving the elderly residents alone in Dorothy's apartment, watching through the window as their hero disappeared into federal custody. Carbone had turned their greatest strength, their unity and organization, into the weapon that would destroy them. They were now completely on their own, facing a criminal with federal immunity and 18 hours to save their homes. The spare key to Murphy's Tavern felt cold in Ruby's hand as she slipped through the alley behind the building, moving carefully through the shadows cast by streetlights that had witnessed decades of neighborhood life. The tavern had been officially sealed for 12 hours. But Ruby Wilson wasn't the type to let bureaucratic paperwork stop her from protecting what mattered. Earl, Dorothy, and Frank followed her through the back in trance, their footsteps echoing in the empty space that had been their community's heart for so many years. The familiar smell of old wood and honest work remained, even though the life had been temporarily drained from the place by Carbone's legal manipulation. "If they think shutting down our meeting place will stop us, they don't know what we're made of," Ruby declared, leading the group down the narrow stairs to the basement storage area. Her voice carried the determination of someone who'd spent years taking care of others and wasn't about to stop now. The basement had stored beer, kegs, and cleaning supplies for decades, but within an hour it had been transformed into something approaching a command center. Earl's business experience showed as he organized the space efficiently. Dorothy's sewing skills helped coordinate the logistics of moving chairs and tables. Frank, despite his recent hospital stay, insisted on helping arrange seating for what would become their new headquarters. Mike had vanished into the network of safe houses that Kevin Rooney and Lou Benedetto had arranged through their boxing connections. Rather than surrender to Carbone's federal immunity deal, he'd chosen to go underground, using the city's interconnected communities to stay one step ahead of law enforcement while coordinating resistance efforts. If we can't fight this through official channels, Mike had told Ruby during their midnight meeting in the basement, then we fight it through community channels. Carbone's made one mistake. He thinks this is just about our neighborhood. Lou Benedetto's boxing network had evolved into something approaching an underground railroad for information and resources. Former fighters, trainers, and gym owners throughout Queens provided communication links, safe houses, and coordination points for an operation that was growing beyond Carbone's ability to monitor or control. The revelation that other neighborhoods faced identical threats had transformed their resistance from local self-defense into borough-wide community organizing. Corona, Elmhurst, and Jackson Heights had all reported systematic elder abuse using the same methods Apex Development had perfected in their neighborhood. This isn't just about Murphy's Tavern anymore, Ruby told the assembled group as they settled into their basement headquarters. It's about every working-class community in Queens where elderly people own property that developers want to steal. Dorothy spread maps across a fall. Same methods, same targets, same corruption network. Carbone's been busy. Mike realized they weren't just fighting for their own community anymore. They were fighting for the principle that elderly people deserve to live with dignity in the neighborhoods they'd spent lifetimes building. Are you ready for that big a fight? Ruby asked, echoing the question that had started this entire resistance. Mike looked around the basement at the faces of people who'd become family through shared adversity, then at the maps showing the scope of systematic abuse throughout Queens. We're not just ready, he said quietly. We're necessary. The transformation of Murphy's basement into a training center happened gradually over several days, but the energy was immediate and infectious. Mike arrived each morning at dawn to find young adults from affected neighborhoods already gathered. Marcus Williams with his natural athletic ability, Tony Santos carrying his grandfather's determination to fight back, Lisa Chun bringing law school knowledge to supplement street wisdom. This isn't just boxing training, Mike explained as he taught proper stance and footwork. This is community organizing with a fighting spirit. Every technique we learn here applies to protecting people who can't protect themselves. Marcus, Ruby's nephew, had been the first to understand the deeper purpose. Fresh from jail, but eager to channel his energy productively, he absorbed Mike's lessons about discipline and strategy while learning to see physical training as preparation for community defense. Footwork represents staying mobile and hard to pin down, Mike demonstrated, moving with the grace that had made him legendary. When they try to isolate you, you move. When they try to pressure you, you sidestep. When they try to corner you, you create space. Tony Santos, Maria's grandson, brought the intensity of someone whose family had already lost everything to Carbone's schemes. His grandfather's bakery was gone, but Tony channeled his anger into learning combinations that served as metaphors for coordinated group action. Defense means protecting vulnerable community members, Mike continued, teaching head movement and blocking techniques. You don't just protect yourself, you position yourself to shield others. You take hits so elderly residents don't have to. Lisa Chun, the law student whose family had been targeted by Apex Development, bridged the gap between Mike's fighting knowledge and the legal framework they were operating within. Her understanding of property law and civil rights helped translate boxing strategy into community organizing tactics. Combinations show how coordinated group action can overcome larger opponents. Mike explained as he taught sequences of punches. Individual actions might not work, but when you coordinate timing and targeting, you can overwhelm any defense. The multi-generational alliance that developed in Murphy's basement was unlike anything the neighborhood had seen before. Elderly residents shared decades of community knowledge while young adults provided energy and technological skills. Mike's boxing experience became the bridge between wisdom and action. Dorothy taught everyone about organizing documentation and evidence. Her seamstress's attention to detail proved invaluable when training young people to spot inconsistencies in legal paperwork. Earl shared business strategies and financial analysis. Frank contributed union organizing principles that had sustained working-class movements for generations. Ruby managed the logistics of running an underground community center, coordinating food, supplies, and communication while maintaining the security that kept their operations hidden from Carbone's surveillance. Real strength comes from protecting those who can't protect themselves, Mike told the assembled group as they completed a week of intensive training. Boxing taught me about individual achievement. But this, he gestured around the basement, filled with people from 3 generations, this is teaching me about collective power. Word had spread through Queens' interconnected communities, and representatives from other affected neighborhoods began attending the training sessions. The basement that had started as a refuge for elderly residents was becoming a model for community self-defense against systematic abuse. Marcus demonstrated the boxing combinations Mike had taught him, but more importantly, he explained how the techniques applied to coordinating protest actions. Tony showed how legal research could identify vulnerabilities in Carbone's network. Lisa presented strategies for using social media to document and broadcast resistance activities. We're not just fighting for our own neighborhoods anymore, Earl observed as the week's training concluded. We're building something that could protect working-class communities throughout the city. Mike looked around the basement at faces that had transformed from fearful to determined, from isolated to connected, from victims to organizers. The elderly residents who'd been targets for systematic abuse were now teachers and strategists. The young adults who'd felt powerless were now skilled in both individual and collective resistance. 1 week ago, Carbone thought he could pick us off one by one because we were just ordinary people, Mike said, addressing the assembled community members. Tomorrow, he's going to learn that ordinary people defending their homes are the strongest force in the world. The basement felt less like a hiding place and more like a launching pad for something that could change not just their neighborhood, but the entire relationship between communities and the forces that threaten them. Corona Park buzzed with nervous energy as Mike led the initial group of 50 people, elderly residents, young adults, families with children, through the early morning mist toward neighborhoods that had suffered under Apex Development's systematic abuse. They carried handmade signs reading, "Protect our elders," and "Stop gentrification through elder abuse." But their real strength lay in the coordination and purpose Mike's training had provided. The march route had been carefully planned to visit each affected neighborhood, allowing residents to see they weren't fighting alone and providing opportunities for others to join the growing demonstration. Dorothy had mapped the most efficient path using her seamstresses. Attention to detail, while Earl's business experience ensured they had proper permits and legal authorization. In the first neighborhood, elderly residents emerged from apartments and small businesses to watch the procession with curiosity that gradually transformed into recognition and hope. Mrs. Rodriguez, whose late husband's auto repair shop had been seized the previous month, stepped out of her door with tears in her eyes. "You're fighting for all of us," she said, joining the march with the dignity of someone who'd thought she was powerless until this moment. By the time they reached Elmhurst, the group had grown to over 100 people. Families came out of houses to join the march, sharing stories that revealed the scope of Carbone's operation. Each neighborhood had experienced the same pattern: elderly property owners targeted with fake legal documents, systematic intimidation, and coordinated theft disguised as legitimate business development. Lisa Chun coordinated social media coverage, with the technical skills that bridged generational gaps in their resistance movement. Her live streaming ensured every story got documented and broadcast, creating a grassroots media approach that proved harder for Carbone to suppress than traditional journalism. "This is what community power looks like," she narrated as her phone captured the growing crowd. People from 5 neighborhoods coming together to say no more to systematic elder abuse. The march's momentum became infectious as word spread. Through Queens' interconnected communities, local business owners offered water and food. Teenagers joined with energy and enthusiasm. Senior citizens brought folding chairs and settled in for the long haul, treating the demonstration like an extended neighborhood gathering. Hashtag Protect Our Elders began trending on social media platforms as the story spread beyond Queens. The imagery was powerful. Mike Tyson leading a peaceful march of elderly residents and community members against corporate predators using legal manipulation to steal homes. Politicians who had previously ignored Carbone's systematic abuse suddenly found themselves forced to take public positions. City council members who had accepted Apex Development's campaign contributions now distanced themselves from the company. Community leaders from Brooklyn and the Bronx offered support, recognizing similar threats in their own neighborhoods. Vincent Carbone's response came in the form of a hastily organized press conference held outside his Manhattan office. Flanked by expensive lawyers and surrounded by the symbols of legitimate business success, he portrayed the march as harassment orchestrated by outside agitators. "This demonstration is led by a convicted criminal," Carbone declared, his confident demeanor intact despite the pressure. "Mike Tyson is using his celebrity status to interfere with legitimate business development and create public disorder." His lawyers presented legal documentation claiming the march represented coordinated harassment of a lawful business operation. They threatened injunctions, criminal charges, and civil litigation against anyone participating in what they characterized as an organized intimidation campaign. But Carbone's press conference only provided more fuel for the march's momentum. His polished corporate presentation contrasted sharply with the authentic stories of elderly residents losing their homes, creating a visual narrative that favored the community over the corporation. The march concluded at Queensborough Hall, where Mike addressed the crowd of over 200 people with the moral authority of someone who'd earned his leadership through action rather than appointment. "This isn't about me," he declared, his voice carrying across the plaza. "This isn't about one neighborhood. This is about whether we'll let criminals steal our communities using fake legal papers and corruption. Tomorrow, they're planning to seize the last properties in our neighborhood. We're going to be there to say no more." The crowd responded with determination that had been building for weeks, but everyone understood that the real test would come tomorrow when Carbone made his final move. The march had demonstrated their unity and attracted public attention, but the ultimate confrontation was still ahead. As the crowd dispersed with plans to reconvene at dawn, Mike realized they'd achieved something unprecedented: a community defense network that extended across borough lines and connected people who'd never met but shared the common experience of fighting systematic abuse. Tomorrow would determine whether community power could overcome corporate corruption backed by government authority. The basement of Murphy's Tavern felt like a military command center at 5 o'clock in the morning, maps spread across folding tables, and everyone speaking in the hushed tones of people preparing for battle. Mike, Ruby, Earl, Dorothy, Frank, and the core group reviewed their plan one final time as dawn approached, and Carbone prepared to make his final assault on the remaining properties. 6 locations, coordinated seizures starting at 8 a.m., Dorothy reported, her seamstress's organizational skills evident in the detailed timeline she'd constructed. Emergency court orders filed simultaneously yesterday, sheriff's deputies scheduled for each site. The community defense plan involved peaceful resistance at multiple locations, with teams of residents, young adults with phones for live streaming, and legal observers at each targeted property. Mike would move between sites, providing moral support and ensuring no violence occurred while cameras documented everything for immediate broadcast. "Remember," Mike emphasized as the teams prepared to move out, "this is about overwhelming documentation, not physical confrontation. We create so much evidence of the fraudulent seizures that even Carbone's political protection can't suppress it all." Frank's apartment building drew the first test of their strategy. When sheriff's deputies arrived with Carbone and his lawyer at 8 a.m. sharp, they expected to find one frightened elderly man facing eviction alone. Instead, they encountered 30 community members sitting peacefully on the front steps, singing "We Shall Overcome," while live streaming everything through multiple social media accounts. The deputies, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, called for supervisors as they realized this wasn't the routine property seizure they'd been told to expect. The presence of cameras and the obvious organization of the resistance made them cautious about using force to clear the protesters. "We have legal authority to proceed," Carbone's lawyer declared, waving court documents that looked official but contained the same fabricated violations the community had learned to recognize. and we have the right to peacefully observe and document public proceedings. Earl replied with the formal dignity that had made him a neighborhood patriarch for decades. At Dorothy's building, the confrontation escalated when Carbone arrived, personally with private security contractors instead of legitimate law enforcement. These weren't sheriff's deputies. They were hired muscle wearing fake badges and carrying equipment designed to intimidate rather than serve legal papers. Mike appeared as the contractors tried to force entry, positioning himself between them and the elderly residents while cameras recorded everything. His presence immediately changed the dynamic, transforming what Carbone had planned as a routine intimidation into a public confrontation with a beloved sports figure. "You think you're a hero?" Carbone confronted Mike directly, his polished facade cracking under the pressure of sustained resistance. "You're just a washed-up fighter interfering with legitimate business." Mike's response was measured but carried the moral authority of someone who'd earned respect through protecting others. "I'm just a neighbor protecting neighbors. But you? You're a criminal who steals from senior citizens. That's going to follow you everywhere you go." The confrontation attracted media attention that Carbone hadn't anticipated. Local news crews arrived to find peaceful community members being threatened by private contractors with fake law enforcement credentials. The imagery was devastating for Carbone's claims of legitimate business operations. By noon, none of the scheduled seizures had been completed. The use of fake law enforcement had been exposed on social media, with videos showing private contractors impersonating sheriffs, deputies while trying to steal elderly residents' homes. Real police officers arrived to arrest the contractors for impersonating officers, creating additional legal problems for Carbone's operation. Community members celebrated their successful defense, but Mike remained focused on Carbone's reaction. The developer had been systematically outmaneuvered, his legal manipulation exposed, his political protection compromised by negative publicity. "Enjoy tonight, Mike," Carbone said as he retreated from Dorothy's building, his confidence replaced by something approaching desperation. "Tomorrow I'm bringing people who won't be stopped by cameras and community meetings." As evening approached and the community members gathered in Murphy's basement to celebrate their successful resistance, Mike understood that Carbone's threat represented a fundamental escalation. Having failed to steal the properties through legal manipulation, the developer was preparing to use direct violence against elderly residents and their defenders. The successful defense had demonstrated that community organizing could overcome corruption and intimidation, but it had also forced Carbone into a corner where his only remaining option was abandoning all pretense of legitimate business operations. Tomorrow would determine whether the community's unity and Mike's protective presence could withstand whatever Carbone was planning to bring against them. The next morning brought a different kind of confrontation to Dorothy's building. Instead of sheriff's deputies or private security contractors, Vincent Carbone arrived with 3 men who looked like they'd stepped out of a mixed martial arts competition, professional athletes with the cold confidence of people paid to hurt others. Mike studied them from across the street, recognizing the shift in Carbone's strategy. Having failed to steal the properties through legal manipulation and intimidation, the developer had abandoned all pretense of legitimate business operations in favor of direct violence. "Mr. Tyson wants to interfere with business?" Carbone announced loudly enough for the gathering crowd to hear. "Let's see how he handles some real competition." The lead fighter, a heavily muscled man in his early 30s, stepped forward, with the swagger of someone accustomed to being the most dangerous person in any room. Danny, the Destroyer, Rodriguez had built a reputation for brutality in underground fighting circuits, specializing in hurting opponents rather than simply defeating them. "Heard you used to be somebody," Rodriguez called out, his voice carrying the casual cruelty of a predator who enjoyed his work. "Let's see what's left of the great Mike Tyson." The challenge was issued publicly, with cameras rolling and the community watching. Rodriguez proposed a simple arrangement: fight him one-on-one, and if Mike won, Carbone would abandon his claims to all remaining properties. If Mike lost, the community would stop resisting and accept Carbone's seizures. Mike realized this was exactly what Carbone wanted: to reduce a community struggle to individual combat, making everything depend on one aging boxer's ability to defeat a younger, stronger opponent in his prime. The elderly residents and young adults debated whether Mike should accept what appeared to be an impossible challenge. Earl argued against it with the wisdom of someone who'd spent decades in business negotiations. This isn't about one fight, Mike. It's about all of us standing together. Don't let him make this personal when it's really about the community. But Dorothy surprised everyone with her support for accepting the challenge. Sometimes you have to fight the bully to protect everyone else. And Mike, you're still our champion. Ruby, Marcus, and Tony echoed Dorothy's sentiment. They'd seen Mike train for weeks, watched him teach technique and strategy, witnessed his dedication to protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. Their faith in him was absolute, even if the odds seemed impossible. Mike had 30 minutes to prepare for a fight that would determine his community's fate. Marcus and Tony helped him warm up while Ruby and Dorothy cleared space in the street. The entire neighborhood gathering to form a circle around an impromptu ring marked with spray paint. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone present. This fight represented more than individual combat. It was about whether communities could protect themselves from predatory capitalism, whether experience and character could overcome youth and aggression, whether ordinary people defending their homes could triumph over violence and corruption. Rodriguez entered the makeshift ring with professional confidence, bouncing on his toes and shadowboxing to intimidate his opponent. At 32, he possessed all the physical advantages: speed, strength, conditioning, and the ruthless mentality of someone who fought for money rather than principle. Mike approached the center of the circle with measured calm, his movements economical and controlled. At 57, he carried the weight of age and time away from competition, but also the accumulated wisdom of someone who'd faced the world's best fighters and learned that battles were won in the mind before they were decided by the body. As they faced off in the center of the circle, Rodriguez threw the first punch, a heavy right hand that Mike slipped easily with the defensive skills that had made him legendary. "Let's see what you got, old man," Rodriguez sneered, his confidence intact despite missing his opening shot. Mike's response was a lightning-fast combination that rocked Rodriguez back on his heels, drawing cheers from the community and reminding everyone present why some legends never fade. The real fight had begun. The early exchanges favored Rodriguez's youth and training as he pressed his attack with the relentless aggression of someone confident in his physical advantages. Mike absorbed several hard shots while Rodriguez seemed to land at will, his combinations crisp and powerful enough to stagger the older fighter. Blood flowed from a cut above Mike's eye where Rodriguez's elbow had opened the skin during a clinch. The younger fighter's strategy was obvious: use his conditioning and athleticism to overwhelm Mike quickly before experience could compensate for the disadvantages of age. "Getting tired already, old man?" Rodriguez taunted as he landed another hard shot to Mike's ribs. "This is what happens when legends try to fight real competition." Carbone shouted encouragement from the sidelines, his confidence growing as he watched his hired fighter dominate someone who'd once been the most feared man in boxing. The community's cheers became more desperate as Mike appeared to be losing the battle that would determine their fate. But Earl noticed something the others missed. During a break in action, he approached Mike with water and the wisdom that came from decades of watching fighters in Murphy's Tavern during the great championship bouts. "Remember what you taught those young people," Earl said quietly, his formal dignity intact despite the urgency of the moment. "It's not about being the strongest. It's about being smart and finding your opening." The reminder crystallized something in Mike's approach. He'd been fighting Rodriguez's fight, trying to match youth and athleticism instead of using the ring intelligence that had made him legendary. The shift in strategy was subtle but immediate. Mike began moving differently, using his famous head movement and defensive skills to make Rodriguez miss while looking for counterpunching opportunities. Instead of trying to overwhelm the younger fighter with power, he made Rodriguez pay for every aggressive exchange. "Come on, fight me," Rodriguez demanded as Mike's elusive movement frustrated his attempts to land clean shots. "Stop running and fight." The community became Mike's corner, offering observations and encouragement that helped him adapt his strategy. Marcus spotted Rodriguez's tendency to drop his left hand after throwing combinations. Tony noticed the younger fighter favored his right leg, suggesting an old injury. Lisa observed that Rodriguez became reckless when frustrated. Using their collective intelligence, Mike began dismantling Rodriguez's attack systematically. Every pattern the younger fighter repeated became a trap that Mike exploited with the patience of someone who'd learned to turn opponents' strengths into weaknesses. The tide turned gradually, then suddenly. Rodriguez's conditioning began to fade under the pressure of missing shots and absorbing counters from one of the greatest combination punchers in boxing history. His early confidence transformed into frustration, then desperation as Mike's experience began to show. Dorothy watched with the analytical mind that had made her an excellent seamstress, seeing how Mike's technique adapted to exploit Rodriguez's weaknesses while conserving energy. For the decisive moment, he's not just fighting, she observed to Ruby. He's teaching that young man a lesson. The climax came when Rodriguez, desperate to end the fight quickly, threw everything into a wild combination that left him completely exposed. Mike slipped the punches with the defensive mastery that had made him legendary, then responded with his signature uppercut, perfectly timed, precisely targeted, devastatingly effective. Rodriguez collapsed to the asphalt, his professional confidence shattered along with his consciousness. The community erupted in celebration, but Mike immediately helped his fallen opponent to his feet, showing the dignity and sportsmanship that had made him a champion in more than just boxing. Rodriguez, respectful in defeat, looked at Carbone with disgust. "I'm done. You didn't say anything about fighting a legend. That man just gave me a boxing lesson I'll never forget." But Carbone wasn't finished. His carefully laid plans had been systematically destroyed by community resistance, media exposure, and now physical defeat. Driven to desperation, he abandoned all pretense of civility and pulled a gun from inside his jacket. "This neighborhood belongs to me now," he declared, pointing the weapon at Mike while the community watched in horror. "And anyone who disagrees can join Tyson in the hospital." The moment crystallized everything the fight had been about. The willingness of powerful people to use violence against communities that refused to surrender their dignity and homes to predatory capitalism. Mike stood calmly facing the gun, his protective instincts intact despite the mortal danger, while police sirens wailed in the distance and the final confrontation prepared to unfold. As Carbone's gun trembled in his hand, the wail of police sirens grew louder, converging on Dorothy's building from multiple directions. Detective Ray Molina emerged from the lead car with federal agents. But instead of arresting Mike, they moved, with practiced efficiency, to surround Carbone. "Vincent Carbone," Agent Sarah Martinez announced with federal authority, "you're under arrest for racketeering, elder abuse, conspiracy, fraud, and assault with a deadly weapon." Carbone's face went pale as he realized the scope of his miscalculation. "You can't arrest me. I have immunity. I have a deal with the federal government." "Your immunity deal was voided the moment you escalated to violence and weapons," Martinez replied calmly as federal agents disarmed Carbone and placed him in handcuffs. "Every threat you made today was recorded, and threatening senior citizens with a firearm constitutes domestic terrorism under federal law." The final twist unfolded as Detective Molina explained the truth behind months of apparent corruption. "Vincent Carbone, everything you've said and done for the past 4 months has been recorded as part of a federal investigation into systematic elder abuse throughout the Northeast Corridor." Mike and the community members listened in amazement as the real story emerged. Molina's cooperation with Carbone had been a federal sting operation from the beginning, designed to document the full scope of Apex Development's criminal enterprise. "My son Danny was never actually in legal jeopardy," Molina continued, his relief evident as months of deception finally ended. "The drug evidence was fabricated by federal agents to establish my cover story. Everything I did to help Carbone was recorded and will be used as evidence against his entire organization." Agent Martinez revealed the scope of the federal case that had been building for over a year. Apex Development was part of a nationwide scheme targeting elderly communities. In major cities, we've documented theft of over $50 million in property through fraudulent legal schemes across New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, and Pennsylvania. The systematic nature of Carbone's operation had attracted federal attention when elderly victims in multiple states began reporting identical harassment techniques. Mike's intervention and the community's resistance had provided the public pressure needed to accelerate the federal timeline. "Your community organizing forced Carbone into the open where his crimes could be documented and witnessed," Martinez explained. Without your resistance, he might have completed his theft and moved to other cities before we could build a prosecutable case. Federal agents had evidence to return all stolen properties to their rightful owners. Frank would get his apartment building back. Earl would reclaim his store. Dorothy's late husband's auto shop would be returned to her family. Rose Kelly would get back her husband's barbershop. Murphy's Tavern would reopen under Ruby's ownership. The political officials who'd enabled Carbone's operation faced their own federal charges. Judge Patricia Morgan was arrested for accepting bribes and manipulating court proceedings. City council members who'd taken campaign contributions in exchange for zoning favors were led away in handcuffs. Building inspectors who'd filed false violation reports were charged with fraud and conspiracy. As Carbone was led away, he screamed about his connections and threatened legal retaliation, but his political allies were facing their own federal investigations. The network of corruption that had made his systematic theft possible was being dismantled piece by piece. "How long have you been planning this?" Mike asked Agent Martinez as they watched Carbone's arrest. 18 months of surveillance and documentation," she replied. "But we needed someone with your profile to force public attention on the crimes. Your willingness to go to jail defending elderly residents provided the moral clarity that made prosecution inevitable." 6 months later, Murphy's Tavern reopened with a celebration that filled the streets of the restored neighborhood. Frank, Dorothy, Earl, and Ruby sat at their usual spots, but they were joined by new friends: Marcus, Tony, Lisa, and other young adults who'd helped in the fight. The community that had nearly been destroyed was now stronger than ever, protected by federal legislation that used their case as a model for preventing systematic elder abuse. Mike sat at the bar, drinking his usual ginger ale, watching the community he'd helped save continue to thrive. 1 year later, autumn sunlight streamed through the windows of the Earl Patterson Community Boxing and Education Center as Mike cut the ribbon on what had once been Earl's grocery store. The restored building now housed boxing training equipment, legal education resources, and community organizing workshops, a living memorial to the man whose death had galvanized the neighborhood's resistance. Earl, now 76 but energetic with renewed purpose, served as the center's community liaison. His formal dignity remained intact, but there was something lighter in his bearing, the satisfaction of someone who'd not only survived systematic abuse, but transformed it into community strength. 40 years I ran a grocery store here," Earl said, addressing the crowd gathered for the opening ceremony. "I thought that was my contribution to the neighborhood. Turns out it was just preparation for something bigger." The center had become a model for community self-defense against gentrification schemes, attracting delegations from other cities who wanted to learn about organizing elderly residents and using boxing training as community building. Mike taught weekly classes, but the real teachers were Dorothy, legal document analysis; Ruby, community meeting facilitation; and Frank, tenant organizing. Dorothy's apartment had evolved into an informal legal clinic where elderly residents learned to identify fraudulent paperwork and understand their rights. Her seamstress's attention to detail made her excellent at spotting the inconsistencies that marked predatory legal schemes. Frank's apartment building had become a model for cooperative senior housing, with residents sharing resources and providing mutual support. His union organizing experience guided their collective decision-making, creating a community that was stronger because its members looked out for each other. Ruby ran Murphy's Tavern with the same maternal efficiency that had made it a neighborhood institution, but now the evening regulars included young adults who'd learned about community organizing alongside boxing fundamentals. The intergenerational friendships forged during the struggle continued to flourish. Marcus was finishing his second year of college, studying community organizing and social work. Tony had started a neighborhood watch program that coordinated with similar groups throughout Queens. Lisa had graduated law school and provided free legal services to elderly residents throughout the borough. The wider impact extended far beyond their neighborhood. The federal case against Apex Development had led to the Elder Protection Act, legislation that made systematic abuse of elderly property owners a federal crime with severe penalties. Vincent Carbone was serving 15 years in federal prison, and the investigative methods developed in Queens were now used by community organizers nationwide. Mike had found purpose beyond his boxing legacy: clean, sober, and deeply connected to a community that saw him not as a celebrity, but as a neighbor who'd stood up when it mattered. He discovered that his greatest victories came from protecting others rather than defeating opponents. The relationships formed during the crisis had evolved into genuine family bonds. Dorothy showed Mike photos of her granddaughter's college graduation. Earl discussed plans for expanding the community center to serve other at-risk neighborhoods. Frank talked about his son's upcoming visit and how proud he was of the community they'd built together. As the day's celebration wound down, Mike found himself back at Murphy's Tavern where this entire story had begun. Ruby served him his usual ginger ale while the evening regulars gathered for their daily social hour, a tradition that had survived systematic assault and emerged stronger. The neighborhood that almost disappeared was now thriving, protected by federal legislation and the knowledge that when powerful forces threatened what was precious, ordinary people could become extraordinary, especially when they had champions willing to stand with them. Frank raised his beer in the toast that had become tradition to Mike Tyson, who showed us that real champions don't just fight for themselves, they fight for their community. Mike, embarrassed by the attention as always, responded with the humility that had made him beloved. "I just did what any good neighbor would do. But you all taught me something more important, that the strongest thing in the world isn't a punch or a trophy. It's people taking care of each other." Through the tavern window, the neighborhood Mike had helped save displayed its resilience. Earl's community center with lights on and young people learning inside. Dorothy's building where families lived with dignity. Frank's cooperative housing, where elderly residents supported each other, and the streets where children played safely. The community that had faced destruction was now a model for others, proving that when bullies threatened what mattered most, ordinary people defending their homes could achieve extraordinary things, especially when they had a champion willing to stand with them against any odds. In the end, Mike Tyson's greatest victory wasn't won in a boxing ring, but in the quiet dignity of a neighborhood tavern where people took care of each other and nobody fought alone. If you like the story, please watch another story on our channel and subscribe to the channel.